The stranger's hands wouldn't stop shaking. That was the first thing 7-year-old Maisie Rowan noticed. Not the 30 Harleys lined up like iron soldiers outside the Clarkson diner. Not the weathered men in black leather who owned them. Not even her mother's hand tightening around hers hard enough to leave marks. Just those hands, trembling near a gas tank, doing something they weren't supposed to be doing. Every adult in that parking lot looked away. Fear has a way of making people blind. Maisie walked forward. What happened in the next 4 minutes would force an entire town to rethink everything it believed about the men it had spent 30 years being afraid of. And one little girl would be the reason none of them died that morning. This is Iron and Innocence. Stay until the end. I promise you won't see that final scene coming. If this story moves you, hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's get into it. The morning came in low and gray, the way Kentucky summer mornings sometimes do when the heat hasn't decided yet whether it wants to rise or just sit heavy on the ground like something that gave up. Humidity hung in the air above Route 9 like a second skin, pressing against everything. The gas station awning, the faded American flag above the VFW hall, the chrome fenders of 30 Harley-Davidson motorcycles parked in an uneven row along the east side of the Clarkson Diner's gravel lot. Elena Rowan noticed the motorcycles before she noticed anything else. She always did. She was 34 years old and had lived in Clarkson, Kentucky her entire life, which meant she had grown up understanding two things as absolute truth: that the county's unemployment rate would never fall below 12%, and that the Iron Lantern Riders owned whatever room, road, or parking lot they occupied, not through paperwork or deed, through presence alone. Through the particular quality of silence that surrounded 30 men who had all, in one way or another, stopped being afraid of consequences a long time ago. Elena crossed the gravel with Maisie's hand locked in hers, her canvas grocery bag hitting her hip with each step, her eyes fixed on the diner's glass door 20 yards ahead. She did not look at the motorcycles. She did not look at the men sitting on the diner's covered porch, coffee mugs going cold in their hands, watching the morning with the practiced stillness of people who had learned that patience was a form of power. She looked at the door. Only the door. Maisie looked at everything. "Mama." The girl's voice was quiet, unhurried, carrying that particular tone she used when she was reporting something factual rather than asking a question. "That man is touching one of their bikes." Elena didn't slow down. "Don't stare, baby. He's not supposed to be." "Maisie? He's shaking, Mama. His hands are shaking really bad." Elena's stride broke just slightly. A half step, nothing more. And despite every instinct she had developed over 34 years of learning how to move through spaces that didn't entirely belong to her, her eyes went sideways. Across the gravel lot, partially obscured by the second-to-last motorcycle in the row, a man crouched low between two Harleys. He was average in every way that made people easy to overlook. Medium height, brown jacket, nothing remarkable, except for his hands, which were moving quickly and poorly over the underside of a gas tank, and which were, as Maisie had correctly identified, trembling with something that was either guilt or fear, or the specific combination of both that tends to show up in people doing things they cannot take back. Elena's heart did something small and terrible in her chest. She tightened her grip on Maisie's hand and pulled her forward. The diner door was 15 yards away. 12. The smart thing, the safe thing, the thing that every working understanding of self-preservation in this town pointed toward, was to keep walking, get inside, get coffee, get groceries, get gone. Whatever was happening in that gravel lot was not her business. It had never been her business. The Iron Lantern Riders were not the kind of people you inserted yourself around. They were not the kind of situation you stepped into. They were the kind of thing you navigated around quietly, respectfully, and with the full understanding that the space they occupied was theirs. Maisie stopped walking. "Baby," Elena started. "He's going to hurt somebody's bike, Mama." "That is not our problem." Maisie looked up at her. 7 years old, brown eyes, a gap where her left front tooth used to be, wearing sneakers with Velcro straps because she hadn't fully committed to learning laces yet. She looked at her mother with an expression that was too steady for her age, too calm, the kind of look that Elena had been seeing on her daughter's face since she was 4 years old and had told the neighbor's dog to stop barking at the mailman with a firmness that made the dog actually stop. It will be their problem, Maisie said simply, and then they'll be sad. Elena opened her mouth, closed it. The gravel lot stretched between them and the porch. On the porch, the men in leather sat with their coffee, their backs to the parking lot, talking low. Nobody was watching. Nobody had noticed. The man between the motorcycles was faster now, more certain in the way that people get when they realize nobody is looking. Elena thought, someone is going to get killed on a highway, and I will have walked into a diner and ordered eggs. Maisie had already let go of her hand. Maisie, Elena's voice came out strange. Maisie, you come back here right now. But Maisie was already crossing the gravel lot, her Velcro sneakers crunching with each small step, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who had decided on a course of action and saw no reason to question it. She did not run. She did not hesitate. She walked straight across the open ground toward the porch, where the nearest biker sat with his back to her, and Elena stood frozen at the edge of the lot, her grocery bag hanging from numb fingers, watching her 7-year-old daughter approach 30 men that this entire town crossed the street to avoid. The nearest man on the porch was large. That was the first thing. Not tall particularly, maybe 6 feet, but built in the specific way that suggested his body had been subjected to serious demands over a long period of time and had adapted accordingly. Dark hair going silver at the temples. A beard that had clearly made peace with not being shaped. His leather vest was black and worn to the softness of old skin, covered in patches that Elena was too far away and too frightened to read. A long scar ran from below his left ear to the corner of his jaw. Not dramatic, not fresh, just present the way old injuries become present, part of the landscape of a face rather than a feature of it. He was looking out at Route 9, his coffee mug balanced on his knee, when the small voice said, "Excuse me, sir." Rhett Maddox turned. Later, he would try to explain to Silas what his first thought was when he saw her standing there, this small, serious child with no front tooth and Velcro sneakers, looking up at him with brown eyes that held approximately zero fear, and he would not be able to find the right words. What he would say, eventually, after some silence, was that she looked like she was reporting something, like she had information that needed to be delivered and had simply identified the nearest capable adult, which was exactly what she was doing. "There's a man," Maisie said, "over by your motorcycles. He's touching the gas part of one of them, and his hands are really shaking, and I don't think he's supposed to be doing that." Rhett set down his coffee. He did not ask her to repeat herself. He did not look over her head for a parent or a context that would explain her presence. He stood up from the porch chair with a single fluid motion, the kind of motion that looks effortless only because the person making it has stood up from a great many situations quickly and learned to do it without telegraphing urgency. And he looked across the gravel lot, 30 seconds. That was all it took. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He simply turned his head slightly and said, low and even, the way you speak to people who are already paying attention, "Brothers." The word moved through the porch like current through wire. Men put down their mugs. Men straightened. Men looked at Rhett, and Rhett's eyes were already moving across the parking lot with the particular precision of someone who had spent years learning to read space and threat at the same time. 2 words, barely above a murmur. East Row. What happened next was the thing Elena would try to describe for months afterward and fail every time. Not because she lacked words, but because the words available to her had been shaped by a lifetime of understanding the Iron Lantern Riders as a source of danger, and what she watched happen in the following 30 seconds did not fit inside that understanding. They moved like water. Not fast, exactly. Not the chaotic scramble she would have expected. Not the aggressive surge of men looking for a fight. They moved with a precision that was almost quiet, dispersing across the lot in a pattern that she realized, slowly, was not random at all. They were positioning. They were creating a perimeter. 3 men cut around the far end of the motorcycle row. 2 more came from the diner's side door she hadn't known existed. Rhett moved directly across the center of the lot, not running, just covering ground with a long stride that ate the distance without announcing itself. Within 30 seconds, the man crouching between the motorcycles was surrounded. Not with weapons drawn, not with shouting, not with any of the violence that Elena had always assumed sat right beneath the surface of these men, waiting for permission to emerge. Just with presence, just with bodies, positioned and still, 30 men forming a quiet ring around one person who had run out of options and hadn't quite realized it yet. The man between the motorcycles, Grant Hollis, though Elena didn't know his name yet, looked up and found Rhett standing 3 feet away, and the sound he made was small and broken, and not remotely like the sound of someone who still believed he could walk out of this. Rhett's voice, when he spoke, was level, almost quiet. Step away from the bike. Elena realized she had walked halfway across the gravel lot without deciding to. Maisie was beside her, holding her hand again, watching with the calm attention of someone at an educational exhibit. "Mama," Maisie said, not whispering, just speaking at her normal volume. "They're not going to hurt him." Elena looked at her daughter. "How do you know that?" Maisie considered this seriously. "Because they would have already." She was not wrong. Grant Hollis stood slowly. His hands came up, not because anyone had told him to raise them, but because his body had already made the calculation that surrender was the only available architecture. He was 43 years old, with deep lines around his mouth and eyes that had the particular washed-out quality of someone who had been living inside a grievance for so long that the grievance had become the only furniture in the room. Rhett looked at him, looked at the motorcycle, crouched without taking his eyes off Grant, and examined the underside of the gas tank, and Elena watched something move across Rhett's face. Not rage exactly, though rage was in there somewhere, compressed and controlled, more like the expression of a man confronting something he had almost not known to look for. He stood up, looked at Grant. Then he looked back over his shoulder, across the lot, toward the porch, where Maisie was standing, and his expression did something complicated and quiet. "Somebody get Silas," he said. Silas Crow did not look like the president of anything. He was 61 years old, built narrow through the shoulders in a way that suggested he'd been broader once, and the years had gradually revised the blueprint. His face was the kind of face that accumulates geography, lines and marks, and the residue of weather and decisions, and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying things for a very long time. He had pale gray eyes that people who didn't know him tended to read as cold, and people who did know him understood were simply always calculating, always reading the room 2 steps ahead of what the room was saying. He came out of the diner's back booth where he'd been working through paperwork for the garage. Iron Lantern Auto, the legitimate business that had occupied the building adjacent to the clubhouse for 22 years. And he crossed the lot without hurry, his coffee still in his hand, his boots leaving precise impressions in the gravel. He took in the scene in the way he took in everything, completely, immediately, without visible reaction. Grant Hollis, Rhett's bike, the positioning of 30 men, the woman standing at the edge of the lot with a grocery bag and a look on her face, like someone who had just watched the world rearrange itself into a shape she didn't have a map for. And the child beside her, composed and watchful, sneakers crunching softly as she shifted her weight from foot to foot. Silas stopped in front of Grant Hollis, looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Around them, the engines of 30 Harleys sat cooling in the morning heat, ticking their metallic rhythms, exhaling the faint ghost of oil and iron. A semi moved through on Route 9, its wake pushing hot air across the lot. Somewhere in the diner, somebody laughed at something. "You want to tell me," Silas said, "what you were doing to Rhett's bike?" Grant's jaw worked. His hands, still raised, had developed a fine tremor that was no longer nerves but something closer to the body's anticipation of consequence. He stopped, started again. "You ruined me." Silas's expression did not change. "I'm going to need you to be more specific." 4 years ago. The words came out broken at the edges, like something that had been pressed against for a long time and had finally cracked. "My garage. You opened yours 6 months after I came to you for a loan and you said no, and then I said no to the loan," Silas said. "That's accurate. You opened a competing shop 6 months later. I opened a shop that I had been planning for 3 years. Yes. You took my customers." Silas was quiet for a moment. The morning pressed down on the lot, heavy and breathless. Your customers came to a shop that offered better prices and faster work. That's not something I did to you, Grant. That's the market. You destroyed my family. Grant's voice cracked on the word family in a way that landed in the chest rather than the ears. My wife left. I lost the house. I I had nothing left. I've had nothing left for 4 years, and you're still... He gestured at the motorcycles, the men, the building across the street. You're still here, like nothing happened. Silence. Rhett's expression had moved from controlled fury to something more complicated. He was looking at Grant with the particular expression of a man who has discovered that his rage and his compassion have arrived at the same place at the same time and aren't sure how to share the space. Silas set his coffee mug on the seat of the nearest Harley. Very carefully. Then he looked back at Grant. What did you put on the bike? It wasn't a question. It had the tone of something that had already been answered and just needed to be said aloud. Grant swallowed. Fuel line fitting. Loosened it. At highway speed with the vibration... He didn't finish. At highway speed, Silas repeated quietly, Rhett would have had a fuel leak directly onto a hot engine block. Silence again. Longer this time. A few of the men around the perimeter shifted their weight almost imperceptibly. Boots on gravel, a soft sound, restrained. Rhett rides with his niece on Sundays, one of the men said from somewhere in the ring. He said it without heat, without accusation, just as a fact being introduced into evidence. Elena watched Grant Hollis's face absorb that sentence, watched it go through him like voltage. His hands, still raised, began to shake again, different from before. Not the shaking of someone caught, but the shaking of someone who had just understood completely, and for the first time, what they had been about to do. I didn't know about... he started. No, Silas said. You didn't. He turned away from Grant then, which was, Elena realized, the most devastating thing he could have done. The complete withdrawal of attention. He left 2 men to keep Grant still. Not touching him, just present, bodies between him and the road. And he walked back across the lot, toward Maisie. Elena's instinct, when Silas Crow walked toward her daughter, was to step between them. The instinct was fast and muscular, and not entirely rational, because she had now watched this man handle a potentially lethal situation with the restraint and precision of someone who had learned a very long time ago that controlled force was more powerful than applied violence. She knew this. She had watched it with her own eyes. She stepped between them anyway. That was what her body did. Silas stopped. He looked at her with those gray, calculating eyes, and then something in them shifted, just slightly, barely visible, into something closer to recognition. He nodded, once, a small acknowledgement of the territory she was marking. I'm not going to frighten her, he said. You frighten everyone, Elena said. It came out more honest than she'd intended. Yeah, he said it flatly, without defensiveness. I know. Maisie appeared at Elena's hip. She looked up at Silas. Are you the leader? Silas looked down at her. He appeared to do a brief internal recalibration, the way adults do when children ask them direct questions that they would have preferred to receive at an angle. Something like that. Rhett told you I was the one who told him, Maisie said. Not a question. He did. Is the bike going to be okay? Silas crouched. He did it slowly, the way large people do when they want to reduce themselves to a child's eye level, and Elena watched the geography of his face rearrange slightly in a way she couldn't quite categorize. Not softness, exactly. She had a feeling Silas Crow's face didn't do softness the way most faces do, more like the careful opening of something that was usually kept closed. The bike is fine, he said. Rhett is fine, because you came and found him. Maisie considered this seriously. I just told him. He did the rest. Yeah, Silas said, but you started it. He was quiet for a moment, and something moved behind his eyes. Some private accounting, something internal being weighed and measured in a currency that Elena couldn't read. Then he said, very quietly, not quite to Maisie, and not quite to himself, takes more than most people have, you know. Deciding to walk toward something like that instead of away. Maisie looked at him. My teacher says courage isn't not being scared. It's being scared and going anyway. Silas was still for a moment. Then he said, "Your teacher's right." He stood up, looked at Elena. His expression had returned to its baseline, careful, measuring, stripped of any excess communication. "We're going to preserve what's on the bike. Document it. Call the sheriff." Elena stared at him. "You're calling the police." "We're calling the sheriff," he said again. Not a correction, just a statement. Grant Hollis needs to answer for what he intended, not to us, through proper channels. Elena heard her own voice come out strange. Why? He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that felt like it was reading something she hadn't said. "Because we don't deliver punishment. We protect what needs protecting." A pause, barely a beat. "Sometimes that means stepping back and letting the law do what it's there to do." He walked away before she could respond. The sheriff arrived 34 minutes later. His name was Deputy Marcus Aller. The actual sheriff was 2 counties over at a conference, and he pulled into the gravel lot in a cruiser with a slightly cracked front bumper and the look of a man who had been told over the radio that he was responding to an incident at the Iron Lantern Riders parking lot and had spent the intervening time preparing for something that was going to require paperwork, backup, and possibly a conversation with his union rep. What he found was 30 bikers standing in an orderly perimeter around one man who was seated on the diner's porch step with his hands in his lap. The motorcycles hadn't moved. Nobody appeared to be injured. The air smelled like coffee and gravel dust and the ghost of cigarette smoke from the last 4 people who had stepped off the porch to light up, and then, after a look from Silas, put the cigarettes away. Aller sat in his cruiser for a moment. Elena watched him through the diner window, where she had finally brought Maisie to sit, because the child was asking for hot chocolate with the patient tenacity of someone who had done everything that was required of them and now felt entitled to compensation. Then Aller got out. Silas met him at the edge of the lot. There was no performance in it, no elaborate deference, no manufactured hostility. Just 2 men standing in a gravel lot in the morning, one of them with a badge and one of them with a scar along his jaw, looking at each other with the specific absence of warmth that characterizes relationships between law enforcement and outlaw motorcycle clubs in every small American town that has both. "Silas," Aller said. "Marcus," Silas said. "What happened?" Silas walked him through it. Short sentences, precise information, no editorializing. One of his brothers brought the photographs they'd taken of the fuel line fitting before any of it was touched. Phone pictures, multiple angles, time-stamped. Aller looked at the photographs, looked at the bike, looked at Grant Hollis on the step. "You confess?" Aller asked. "To me. Voluntarily. You'll want to hear it from him yourself." Aller studied Silas for a moment. "You didn't?" "No." Another moment. "None of your guys?" "No," Silas said. "Nobody touched him. Nobody touched the bike after we found it. Nobody touched anything." Elena watched Aller's face do something she could only describe as recalibration, the same internal rearrangement she had felt in herself, the grinding of a mental gear that had been set in one direction for a long time and was being asked to consider reversing. "You have a witness?" Aller asked. Silas nodded toward the diner window. 7 years old. She's the one who noticed and came to us. Aller looked at the window, looked back at Silas. "A kid." "Yeah." Aller put his pen in his shirt pocket. He looked at the lot, the motorcycles, the 30 men standing in their unhurried ring, and then he looked back at Silas with the expression of a man arriving at a conclusion he hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. "I'm going to need statements from everybody who was present when—" "Already written up," Silas said. He produced a folded sheaf of papers from the inside pocket of his vest. "All signed. Retz is on top. It's his bike." Aller took the papers, stared at them. "You wrote statements." "We wrote statements," Silas confirmed. The deputy unfolded the papers, read the top one, read it again. Then he tucked them carefully into his clipboard and walked toward the porch step where Grant Hollis was sitting. Elena watched through the glass. She watched Aller read Grant his rights in the flat, procedural cadence of someone who has done it so many times it has become a kind of mantra. She watched Grant stand and turn and let his hands be placed behind his back. And she watched Grant's face as it happened. Not the anger or the resistance she might have expected, but something quieter and more desolate. The face of a man confronting what he had almost done, and finding that the confrontation was worse than any punishment could be. Because he had to look across the parking lot at where Maisie had been standing, the little girl who walked forward when every adult turned away. Rhett stood beside his motorcycle after Aller had photographed everything and cleared the area. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the fuel line fitting that was now bagged and tagged and sitting in the back of a sheriff's cruiser. And he thought about Sunday mornings. He thought about his niece, Carly, who was 9 years old and who liked to sit on the back of the bike with her helmet 2 sizes too big tilting over her eyes, who held onto his jacket with both hands and said nothing. The entire ride, because she had told him once that the sound of the engine was the loudest quiet she'd ever heard, and he had understood exactly what she meant. He thought about the highway, about highway speed, about vibration and fuel and hot metal, and what happens when those things coincide in the wrong sequence. His chest felt like something had been built inside it without his permission, some structure made of iron that pressed outward against his ribs from the inside. He didn't make a sound. He wasn't the kind of man who made sounds for things like this. But he stood by the bike for a long time, longer than was necessary, and around him his brothers gave him the particular wide berth that men who understand grief without discussing it extend to each other in moments of near miss. After a while, he became aware of a presence at his elbow, small, very slightly below his line of sight. He looked down. Maisie was standing in there with a cup of hot chocolate, actual hot chocolate, paper cup with a plastic lid, clearly purchased from the diner. And she was holding it with both hands because it was still hot. And she was looking up at him with brown eyes that held, he noticed, the same steady absence of fear they'd held when she'd first appeared on the porch. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Rhett said. "Are you sad?" He looked at her for a moment. A little bit. She nodded as if this were a completely reasonable and expected response. "Hot chocolate helps sometimes, but I already had some, so this one's yours if you want it." Rhett looked at the cup she was extending toward him. He looked at it for a long moment, the steam coming off the lid, the small hands holding it, the complete and unpretentious sincerity of the offering. He took it. "Thanks," he said. "You're welcome." She tilted her head. "Does your face hurt?" His hand came up involuntarily and touched the scar along his jaw. "Not anymore." "How'd you get it?" "Iraq," he said. Simple. The way you say it when you've said it enough times that it's just information. She considered this. "My dad was in the army," she said. "He didn't come back." The gravel lot went quiet in Rhett's ears in a way that had nothing to do with sound. He looked at her, really looked at her, at the gap-toothed face and the Velcro sneakers and the serious brown eyes, and somewhere behind his sternum that iron structure pressed harder. A little girl who knew what it meant for someone not to come back, who had still walked forward, who had chosen a parking lot full of scarred strangers over the comfortable blindness of walking past. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it the way you mean things when you have been in the same geography as loss and know how the ground there feels. "It's okay," Maisie said. Then after a beat, "It's not okay, but I'm okay." He stared at her. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "That's exactly right." He reached into the front of his vest, fingers closing on something that had been on that vest so long it had worn a ghost of itself into the leather beneath it. A chrome road pin, small, shaped like a compass rose. The kind of thing clubs gave their road captains to mark the miles and the roads and the years of keeping people on the right heading. He had been given it 12 years ago by the man who held the road captain position before him, who had gotten it from the man before that, and it had lived on his vest through 2 highway wrecks, a surgery, 14 states, and more miles than he could count. He held it out to her. Maisie looked at it, then at him. "What is it?" "Road pin. Road captains wear them. Means you know the way." He paused. "Means you don't turn back when the road gets hard." She picked it up with careful fingers, examined it with the focused attention she seemed to bring to everything. Then she looked up at him. "But you'll need it." "I know where I'm going," he said. She put it in the pocket of her shorts, carefully, both hands like something being stored for safekeeping. Then she looked back up at him and said, with the simple directness that seemed to be her native language, "I'm glad your niece didn't get hurt." Rhett looked at the motorcycle, looked at the morning. The gray sky had begun, at its edges, to admit a thin, sharp line of blue. "Me too, kid," he said. "Me too." Yeah. Elena found her 15 minutes later, sitting on the diner's porch steps with her sneakers side by side on the gravel, watching the police cruiser pull out of the lot with Grant Hollis in the back seat. Elena sat beside her. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The lot was clearing slowly. Men returning to bikes, voices low, the ordinary sounds of a morning resuming its shape after something had briefly distorted it. Engines didn't start yet. The men seemed, collectively and without discussion, to be giving the lot a moment before filling it with sound. "Maisie," Elena said finally, "I need you to understand that what you did was very dangerous." Maisie thought about this seriously, with the genuine consideration she gave to all things before she responded. "I know, but nobody else was going to." "That's not—" Elena stopped. Tried again. "That doesn't mean it was safe for you to—" "Mama." Maisie looked at her. "What if Rhett's niece had been on the bike?" Elena didn't have an answer for that. She sat with the question the way you sit with questions that don't have good answers, which is to say she sat with it uncomfortably and felt it press against the inside of her chest. "You didn't know about the niece," Elena said, but the argument had already lost its architecture. "No," Maisie said, "but somebody would have been." The morning sat between them. On Route 9, a truck passed, its exhaust a low thunder that rolled across the lot and faded east. Somewhere behind them, inside the diner, the short-order cook dropped something metal, and someone laughed. Elena looked at the Iron Lantern riders, at the men on the porch, finishing their coffee now, talking in the low abbreviated way of people who don't need many words to understand each other. At Rhett, still standing by his motorcycle, holding a paper cup of hot chocolate with both hands the same way Maisie had held it. At Silas, who had retreated to the far end of the lot and was standing alone, looking at Route 9 with his hands in his pockets and his back to the diner, carrying whatever it was he was always carrying in the particular private space he seemed to occupy even in the middle of a crowd. She had spent 34 years knowing exactly what these men were. Knowing it in the certain inherited way you know things that have been told to you so many times, they stop sounding like opinions and start sounding like facts. She was no longer entirely sure she had known anything. "Mama," Maisie said. "Yeah, baby." "The man with the scar. He was sad, but he was still nice." Elena looked at Rhett, at the scar that ran the length of his jaw, at the way he was holding the cup. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I noticed that too." "Do you think they're always like that?" Elena considered this for a long moment. The question settled into her with a weight she wasn't sure she'd been prepared to carry, because the honest answer was that she didn't know. She had spent so long not knowing in one particular direction that she had never noticed the possibility of not knowing in another. "I think," she said carefully, "that we didn't know as much as we thought we did." Maisie processed this. Then she leaned against Elena's arm, her head resting on her mother's shoulder, and they sat on the porch steps while the morning burned the gray out of the sky above Clarkson, Kentucky, and the Iron Lantern riders drank their coffee in the particular quiet that follows a disaster that almost happened and didn't. On the far side of the lot, Silas Crow turned away from Route 9. He looked back at the clubhouse, at the building that bore the weight of every story this town had ever told about it, and something moved across his face in the morning light that Elena, watching from the porch, could not quite name. She had the strange and unsettling feeling that she was not the only one who had learned something this morning. What she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that Grant Hollis in the back of Allers' cruiser was already saying a name that didn't belong to Grant Hollis alone, a name that would change everything about what this morning had been. The name was Danny Holt. Aller didn't tell Silas directly. That wasn't how it worked between them. Not because there was any particular warmth in their professional relationship, but because Oler was a careful man who understood the precise difference between sharing information and creating liability. And he walked that line the way experienced deputies learn to walk it in counties where the unofficial power structures don't always align with the official ones. What Aller did was leave his cruiser window down when he took the call. Silas was standing 6 feet away, hands in his pockets, watching Grant Hollis through the glass, and he heard enough. 2 words, repeated twice by the dispatcher on the other end of the radio in that flat procedural cadence that strips all the weight out of things. Danny Holt. And then the question that followed it, which was whether Aller was aware that Daniel Holt had filed a complaint with the county assessor's office 3 weeks ago, naming Iron Lantern Auto as a party to what he described as predatory business practices. Aller closed the window after that. Silas stood in the gravel lot and breathed the morning air, which smelled like diesel and the first edge of rain coming in from the west, and he did not change his expression. He walked back to the clubhouse instead. The back room of the Iron Lantern clubhouse was not what people in Clarkson imagined when they imagined it, which was probably a mercy for everyone involved. It was, in practical terms, a large room with exposed brick walls and a long wooden table that had been salvaged from a church auction in 2003 and had never quite shed the quality of being a place where serious things were decided. Metal folding chairs, a whiteboard with tire inventory numbers on it from a meeting 2 weeks ago that nobody had erased, a coffee maker that was always on, 2 windows that looked out at the side yard where bikes were stored in bad weather, the glass old enough to have that slight waviness that made the motorcycles outside look like they were underwater. Silas sat at the head of the table and did not pour coffee, and did not look at the whiteboard and did not do anything for approximately 3 minutes, except think. Then he said, to the empty room, "Who talked to Danny Holt?" The door behind him opened. Boots on concrete, the specific weight and cadence of them telling him who it was before the voice did. "I was going to bring it to you," Rhett said. "When?" A pause. The sound of a chair being pulled out, not at the table but against the wall. Rhett's habit when he was unsettled, putting himself at a slight remove from the main space. "After I had something more solid." Silas turned around. He looked at Rhett the way he looked at problems, completely, without flinching, reading the geometry of what was actually in front of him rather than what he expected. Rhett was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the scar along his face was doing that thing it did when the muscles beneath it tightened, pulling the skin slightly in a way that made the old wound look fresh. "How long?" Silas said. 3 weeks. "Since the complaint was filed." "Rhett." "Since before that?" Rhett's voice was flat. Not defensive. Rhett rarely got defensive, had learned somewhere between the second tour and the surgery that defensiveness was just fear in a mask that didn't fit right. "Danny Holt has been making noise about us for closer to 2 months. I heard it from Pete Vargas at the hardware store, and then from Della at the county records office, and then from—" "2 months," Silas said. "I know. You let me sit across from Grant Hollis this morning and read him chapter and verse about the loan and the garage and the competition, and you knew there was a second string on this. I didn't know Grant was connected to Danny." Rhett's voice had acquired an edge now, the specific sharpness of someone defending a position they are not entirely certain is defensible. "I knew Danny was making noise. I didn't know Grant was his instrument." Silas was quiet for a long moment. The coffee maker on the counter hissed and spat, working through the end of a cycle. Outside, through the wavery glass, one of the bikes shifted slightly in the morning wind, chrome catching and releasing the thin light. "If Danny Holt organized Grant Hollis," Silas said, slowly, working it through the way he worked through everything, methodically, without rushing the conclusion, "then this morning wasn't a grievance crime. This morning was a contract." Rhett looked at him. The word contract sat between them with its full weight. "Someone paid Grant," Silas said, "or promised him something, or both. We don't know that. We know Grant Hollis lost his garage 4 years ago. We know he's been living on nothing since. We know Danny Holt has had it in for this club since before his father died and left him that property on Route 9 that he thinks we're sitting on wrong." Silas paused. "Put it together, Rhett." "Putting things together isn't evidence." "No," Silas agreed. "It's not." He stood up from the table. "Which is why you should have brought me the noise 2 months ago, so we'd have had time to build the evidence before someone ended up with a loosened fuel fitting at highway speed." The room held the silence between them. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the specific quality of silence that exists between two people who have been through enough together that they can be genuinely angry at each other without it meaning anything has broken, but who also understand that genuine anger in this kind of silence is still real anger and still costs something. Rhett uncrossed his arms, crossed them again. I thought I could handle it quietly. Yeah. Silas's voice had lost its edge, not because the anger was gone, but because the anger had moved somewhere more internal, more contained. You always think that. He walked to the window, stood looking out at the motorcycles in the side yard. His, Rhett's, the prospects' bikes lined up with the slightly less assured parking of people who haven't yet earned the right to take up exactly the space they need. The gray morning pressed against the glass. Danny Holt's name is going to come up in that interview room, he said. Aller's not stupid. Grant will give him something, because Grant is sitting in that cruiser right now understanding exactly what he almost did to a 9-year-old girl, and people in that position give law enforcement everything they have. A beat. When Danny's name surfaces officially, what do you think happens next? Rhett was quiet for a moment. He lawyers up and starts talking about predatory business practices. He lawyers up, starts talking about predatory business practices and points at us, Silas said. And then every story this town has been telling about us for 30 years becomes the frame that everyone uses to look at whatever comes next. He turned from the window. We can't afford to be reactive, Rhett. We have never been able to afford reactive. You know that. What do you want me to do? I want you, Silas said, to tell me everything, right now. Every conversation, every name, every piece of noise you heard about Danny Holt and what he wanted from the county. Start from Pete Vargas at the hardware store. Rhett told him. It took 22 minutes. Silas listened without interrupting, which was one of his specific skills. The ability to receive information completely, to resist the impulse to shape it while it was still arriving. He stood at the window the entire time, his back to the room, watching the side yard. His hands never moved from his jacket pockets. When Rhett finished, Silas was quiet for so long that the coffee maker finished its second cycle and the room filled with the smell of burnt coffee from a pot that had been on too long. Finally, Silas said, Danny Holt wants the Route 9 property. That's my read. He's been blocked from rezoning it as commercial because the club's been here longer than the current zoning codes, which means the only way he gets what he wants is if we're not here. Or if we're here in a different capacity, Rhett said. Something that triggers cause for the county to revisit the operating permits. Silas turned from the window. The particular quality of his expression was one that Rhett had learned over 12 years to read as the outer edge of something deeper. The face Silas made when he was looking at a situation and seeing not just what it was, but what it was trying to become. He's patient, Silas said. 2 months of groundwork, using Grant as insulation. If Grant doesn't give him up, Grant already gave him up, Silas said. The question isn't what Aller knows by end of day. The question is what Danny does when he finds out Grant got caught before the job was done. The back room went quiet again. Rain had started outside, the kind of thin preliminary rain that doesn't commit, just a suggestion of water on the windows, enough to make the chrome in the yard go dull. He's going to move faster, Rhett said. Yeah, Silas said. He's going to move faster. He picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, set it back down. Get me everything we have on the Route 9 property. Deeds, dates, the original operating permits from '94. All of it. He paused. And get me Marcus Aller on the phone. Not the department. Marcus personally. Rhett stood from his chair. He was halfway to the door when Silas said without turning, Rhett. Yeah. Don't handle things quietly anymore. Not without telling me first. A pause at the door. Boots still on the concrete, not moving. Yeah, Rhett said. Okay. He left. The door closed behind him with a sound like something being sealed. Architect. Danny Holt's office was on the second floor of a building on Clarkson's main street that had been a bank in a previous life and still carried the architecture of institutional confidence, high ceilings, thick walls, windows that looked out on the street with the satisfied expression of something that believed it deserved its view. Danny had bought it 8 years ago when he inherited his father's property holdings, and had spent the intervening time converting the ground floor into a title company and the second floor into a space from which he conducted the business of being, in his own estimation, the most important property owner in Harlan County. He was 48 years old and had the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and had since become merely presentable, softened by prosperity and sharpened by grievance in roughly equal measure. He wore clothes that were too carefully chosen for a man who kept telling himself he didn't care what people thought, and he had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent a long time being right about things and have learned to present their rightness as patience. He was standing at his second-floor window when his phone vibrated on the desk behind him. He looked at the screen. The number was one he recognized but had expected not to hear from until later in the day. Much later, after the new news cycle, after the kind of tragic highway accident that turns into a 2-minute segment and a county-wide conversation about motorcycle safety. The number belonged to Grant Hollis. He did not answer it. He stood at the window and watched the main street below him. The diner 2 blocks east, just visible at the corner of his sightline. The gravel lot beyond it where, from this distance, he could see the faint shapes of motorcycles and the movement of people he couldn't quite identify. His jaw was tight. His breathing was slightly elevated in a way that he would not have acknowledged if asked. The phone buzzed again, then stopped. Danny Holt picked up a different phone from his desk drawer. A prepaid one, 3 weeks old, purchased from a gas station in the next county with cash. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he put it back in the drawer and closed it. His assistant knocked on the open office door. Young woman, 26. Efficient in the specific way that comes from working for someone who punishes inefficiency. "Mr. Holt, you have the keen assessment at 11. "Cancel it," he said. "Sir, cancel it and clear my afternoon." He was still looking at the window. "And get me Thomas Fell's number." A pause at the door. "Thomas Fell, the attorney? Is there another Thomas Fell in this county?" "No, sir." "Then yes. Thomas Fell, the attorney." He turned from the window finally, and his face had arrived at something that was not quite calm but was wearing calm's clothing. "And close the door on your way out." She did. Danny Holt sat at his desk, and for the first time in 2 months, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that the morning had not gone as planned. Elena Rowan did not leave the diner when she should have. She had reasons. She told herself she had reasons. Maisie needed to finish her hot chocolate. The rain had started and she hadn't brought an umbrella. The grocery bag was still in her hand and she'd already been standing in the parking lot for the better part of an hour, and whatever she'd meant to buy from the store at the other end of town felt irrelevant now in the way that small errands feel irrelevant after large events. The truth, which she was slower to arrive at, was that she didn't want to leave yet. That she was sitting in the window booth of the Clarkson diner watching the Iron Lantern riders move through the lot, and the morning with the particular attention of someone who has been handed a piece of information that contradicts something they believe to be foundational and who is not yet ready to decide what to do with the contradiction. The waitress, a woman named Cora, who had worked the morning shift since before Elena was born, and who possessed the particular immunity to surprise that comes from decades of observing human behavior through a diner window, refilled Elena's coffee without being asked and said, "They always do that." Elena looked up. "Do what?" "The statements, the photographs, when something happens in the lot." Cora tucked the coffee pot against her hip. "They started doing it about 15 years ago, after the thing with the Reyes boy." She said the last sentence in the tone of someone referencing a known quantity. "What thing with the Reyes boy?" Cora looked at her. "You've been in Clarkson your whole life and you don't know the Reyes story?" "I know the version I know," Elena said, which was the careful answer. Cora was quiet for a moment, seeming to decide something about what category this conversation belonged to. Then she leaned against the counter, not quite sitting, the posture of someone sharing information rather than telling a story. "Luis Reyes, 19 years old, picked a fight with 3 of the Lantern boys outside here one night. Started it himself, witnesses saw it, but those 3 were big men, and Luis ended up with a broken wrist and a concussion, and his mother went straight to the sheriff, and the sheriff at the time wasn't Marcus Aller's predecessor. It was a man named Beach who had his own set of feelings about that club. Elena wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. What happened? What happened is it went to court. And what should have been a clear self-defense case became something else because Beach had been feeding the county paper a certain narrative about those boys for years, and the 3 Lantern members ended up with charges that didn't match what actually happened. 2 of them got 60 days. One lost his job at the mill because of the record. Cora was quiet for a beat. After that, Silas Crow instituted the documentation policy. Anything happens in or around this property, you photograph it, write it up, witness it, sign it, and you hand it to law enforcement before they can ask. Takes away the narrative before it starts. Elena looked out the window at the lot, at the men still moving through it, still quiet, still deliberate. That's actually sophisticated. It's what you do, Cora said simply, when you've been misread enough times. You stop giving people the room to fill in the blanks. She went back to the counter. Maisie, beside Elena, had finished her hot chocolate and was now drawing something on a napkin with a pen she'd produced from somewhere. A girl's economy of entertainment, self-sufficient. Elena watched her for a moment. The drawing appeared to be a motorcycle. "Mama," Maisie said without looking up. "Yeah. Why do people hate them?" Elena looked at the lot again. At Rhett, who had moved from beside his motorcycle to the far end of the porch, where he was on his phone with the concentrated expression of someone receiving information they are processing carefully. At 2 younger men, prospects, though she didn't know the word for it, quietly replacing the yellow police tape that Aller's deputy had strung around the motorcycle and then taken down again after finishing the documentation, doing it without being asked, just maintaining the order of the space. "I don't think everyone hates them," Elena said. "You used to tell me to cross the street when we saw them." Elena looked at her coffee, at the grain of the diner table, at the napkin drawing, which was actually quite good for a 7-year-old. The motorcycle had recognizable dimensions. "Yeah," she said, "I did. Because of their jackets. Because of what I thought the jackets meant." Maisie considered this. "What did you think they meant?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, sitting inside the question. "That they were dangerous." "Rhett has a scar," Maisie said. "That means something hurt him." "Yeah. Something hurt him, and he's still here, and he gave me his compass pin." She looked up from the drawing. "I don't think the jacket is the dangerous part, Mama." Elena looked at her daughter, at this small, gap-toothed, Velcro-shoed human who had walked across a gravel lot toward 30 strangers because it was the right thing to do and had never once, as far as Elena could tell, gone through the calculus of fear that every adult in that lot had performed and then acted on by looking away. She thought, not for the first time today, what does it cost you, learning to be afraid? Before she could find an answer, the diner's front door opened and Silas Crow walked in. He didn't look at her immediately. He went to the counter, spoke briefly to Cora, accepted a coffee mug, and then turned toward the room with the deliberate, unhurried quality that Elena had started to recognize as his baseline, the way he occupied space without announcing himself, without performing anything. He simply arrived, and the room reorganized itself slightly around his presence, the way rooms do around people who have spent a long time being the heaviest thing in them. He looked at her, then at Maisie. Then, with what appeared to be a decision made, he walked to the booth. "Mind," he said, which was not quite a question. Elena gestured at the seat across from her. He sat, put his mug on the table, looked at Maisie's napkin drawing. "That's Rhett's bike," Maisie said. "Pretty good," Silas said. "I know." She went back to drawing. Silas looked at Elena. His gray eyes had that calculating quality she'd noticed in the lot, but there was something underneath it now. Something that had been pressed close to the surface by whatever had happened in the building across the street, something that was not quite urgency, but was adjacent to it. "There's something I should tell you," he said, "before you hear it from someone else." Elena set down her coffee. "Okay." Grant Hollis wasn't acting alone. The diner noise continued around them. Plates, the short-order cook, Cora's footsteps, the rain against the front windows. Elena sat inside what Silas had just said and felt the morning rearrange itself again, in a direction she hadn't been prepared for. Who, she started. I can't give you a name yet. What I can tell you is that what happened in that lot this morning may not be the end of it. He wrapped his hands around his mug. They were large hands, engine-stained at the cuticles in the way of men who work on machinery for a living, a stain that doesn't fully wash out. The person who organized this has a different objective than Grant did. Grant wanted revenge. This other person wants something more structural. What does that mean? It means the lot was one move in a longer game. He was looking at her directly, without the hedging or the softening that people usually apply when they're delivering information they consider alarming. It means there's someone in this town who decided the best way to move against this club was to create an incident. And when this morning's incident didn't work, they'll look for another one. Elena absorbed this. Why are you telling me? He was quiet for a moment, looked at his coffee. Because your daughter saw something this morning that every adult in that lot missed, and because... He stopped. Started again, differently. Because the person organizing this is going to look for new instruments. And the fact that a woman and her child were present this morning, were visible, were connected to what happened. That's a detail that doesn't go unnoticed by someone who plans carefully. The diner felt suddenly smaller, the rain on the windows louder. Elena's hands wrapped around her coffee mug became very still. Are you telling me we're in danger? She said. I'm telling you to be aware of your surroundings for the next few days, he said. I'm telling you to note if anything feels different. If someone asks you questions about what you saw this morning, you don't answer without letting me know first. He slid a card across the table. Plain white, the garage's number, his cell handwritten on the back in a mechanic's blunt print. That's all. Elena picked up the card, looked at it, looked at him. And if something does feel different, if someone does ask, you call that number. And then what? His jaw shifted slightly. And then it stops. The certainty in it, not aggressive, not performed, simply the absolute flatness of someone stating something they have already decided, was more reassuring and more unsettling than anything elaborate he could have said. Maisie looked up from her drawing. She looked at Silas. Are we in trouble? Silas looked at her. Something in his face moved. That same complicated opening she'd seen in the lot when he'd crouched to her eye level. Not if I can help it, he said. Maisie appeared to find this an entirely satisfactory answer. She went back to drawing. Silas stood. Put money on the counter for the coffee he'd barely touched. He was halfway to the door when Elena said, Mr. Crow. He turned. The thing you said in the lot, she said, about calling the sheriff instead of doing anything else. About preserving the evidence. She paused. Did you want to do something else? The question sat in the air between them. Cora was carefully not listening from 3 feet away. Rain tapped the glass. Yes, he said, simply, flatly. Every man out there did. But you didn't. No. Why? He looked at her for a long moment. At her, and then briefly at Maisie, and then back at her, with the expression of someone deciding how much of an answer the question actually warrants. Because a long time ago, I decided that this club would not become what people in this town have always wanted us to be. And some days that decision is harder to keep than others. A pause. Today was a hard day to keep it. He walked out into the rain. Elena sat in the booth for a long time after the door closed. The card was in her hand. Maisie finished her drawing and held it up. Rhett's motorcycle, rendered in diner napkin blue ink, with a small compass rose in the upper corner that she had clearly drawn from memory. For Silas, Maisie said, since he seemed sad. Elena looked at the drawing, at the compass rose, at her daughter's face. Yeah, she said quietly. I think you're right. Jarsa. The afternoon moved in the way that afternoons move after mornings that have demanded too much of everyone. Slowly, heavily, with the particular weight of events that have not yet finished arriving. The rain held through noon and into the early afternoon, thin and persistent, doing nothing dramatic, just sitting on the town like a reminder that the weather didn't particularly care what had happened in a diner parking lot. Rhett spent most of it on the phone. He sat in the garage's office, a small room with a desk that was mostly a surface for organized stacks of paper, and a window that looked onto the service bay, where two prospects were working on a shovelhead engine with the focused silence of men who have been told to stay busy and understand why. Rhett's phone calls were short and precise. Della at the county records office, Pete Vargas, a man named Cutter, who ran a towing operation on the north edge of town and who had, over 12 years, become the club's most reliable informal intelligence channel. He wasn't gathering information so much as he was corroborating what he already suspected and filling in the dimensions of it. Danny Holt owned 6 properties in Clarkson proper and 11 in the surrounding county. 3 of the county properties were currently in various stages of rezoning applications. One of those applications had been filed and then stalled for 14 months, held up by an operational conflict with an existing business license. Iron Lantern Auto's license, specifically, which had been grandfathered under a zoning category that Danny Holt's attorneys had been arguing for over a year, didn't apply to a motorcycle club's operations. The application was up for county board review in 3 weeks. Rhett sat with this information for a while, watching the prospects work on the shovelhead, listening to the rain on the garage's metal roof. A sound like static, like something that was trying to communicate but hadn't resolved into language yet. 3 weeks. He wrote it down, put the piece of paper in front of him on the desk, looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at the service bay, and then looked at the piece of paper again. Then he picked up the phone and called Silas. 3 weeks, he said when Silas answered. A silence on the line. Then, County Board. Yeah. He needs us gone or compromised before the board meeting. Or he needs us looking like something the board can justify moving against. Rhett's pen was moving on the desk, not writing anything, just moving, the physical residue of a mind working too fast for stillness. An incident on our property, something the county can point at. Grant was the incident. Grant failed. Rhett's pen stopped. What's the next one? Silas was quiet for long enough that Rhett could hear the sound of the garage at the other end. The same rain, the same metallic static, the sound of a man moving through a space he had built and was now measuring against the possibility of losing. I've got Thomas Fell's home number, Silas said finally. He's Danny's attorney. You're going to call Danny's attorney. I'm going to call a man I've known for 20 years who happens to be Danny's attorney, and I'm going to have a conversation about property law in Harlan County. And we're going to see what that conversation tells us about where we actually stand. A pause. Which means I need you to get me every piece of documentation we have on the operating permits. Everything from 94 forward. I'll pull it. Tonight, Silas said. I need it tonight. Rhett pulled the files. He spent 3 hours in the back office going through boxes that had been stacked against the far wall since a reorganization effort 4 years ago that had sorted things by year and not by relevance, which meant that what he needed was distributed across 7 boxes in the kind of arrangement that only makes sense to the person who created it and is maddening to everyone else. He made coffee twice and drank neither cup fully. He found the 94 operating permit, found the grandfathering documentation from 97, found the county assessor's correspondence from 2009 and 2014 and 2019 that had each, in their turn, affirmed the operating status of the business. He also found something he hadn't been looking for. It was in the 4th box between a 2007 insurance renewal and a stack of old customer invoices. A letter on county stationery, dated 11 months ago, addressed to Silas Crow at the Iron Lantern Auto address. The letterhead was the county assessor's office. The letter was 2 paragraphs long and bore the specific, carefully neutral language of official correspondence that is conveying something significant while working hard not to sound alarming. It informed Silas that a formal inquiry had been opened into the zoning classification of the Iron Lantern Auto property in response to a petition filed by a neighboring property owner. It noted that Silas had 60 days to respond with documentation supporting the current classification. It was signed by the deputy assessor. Rhett looked at the date on the letter, 11 months ago. He thought about the conversation he'd had with Silas this morning, about Silas saying, "You should have brought me the noise 2 months ago." He sat very still in the office chair for a long moment, the letter in his hand, the rain on the metal roof, the sound of the shovelhead in the bay going quiet as the prospects called it a day and started cleaning up. 11 months ago, Silas had received a formal inquiry from the county assessor. Silas had not told him. He put the letter on top of the pile. He sat with it. He thought about what it meant. Not the legal dimension of it, not the procedural dimension, but the other dimension, the one that existed between men who had been through enough together that silence between them was not neutral, was never neutral, was always a choice about what to carry alone. He thought about Silas saying, "Don't handle things quietly anymore, not without telling me first." He thought about Silas standing at the window of the back room this morning, looking at the motorcycles in the side yard, his hands in his pockets, his back to the room. He put the letter in his jacket pocket. He sat in the office for another few minutes, listening to the rain, and then he got up and walked through the garage and out into the late afternoon, which smelled like wet gravel and oil and the particular sharpness of air that has been raining all day and is only now considering stopping. Silas was in the side yard, covered by the lean-to that extended from the garage's back wall, doing something to a carburetor with his hands, and not particularly appearing to be thinking about carburetors. He heard Rhett's boots on the wet gravel, and he didn't turn around immediately, finishing whatever he was doing with the particular deliberateness of a man who is using a task to buy himself time. "Find everything?" he said. Rhett stopped a few feet away, reached into his jacket pocket, set the letter on the workbench beside the carburetor. Silas looked at it. His hands, holding the small tool he'd been using on the carburetor, went still. "Yeah," Rhett said. "Everything." Silas put down the tool, picked up the letter, looked at it the way you look at something you wrote yourself and buried and had half hoped would stay buried. His expression did not change, which was itself, Rhett had long since learned, a form of expression, the specific stillness that Silas wore when something had arrived that he had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. "How long did you think you could manage this without telling the table?" Rhett said. "I was managing it." "You were managing an 11-month formal inquiry from the county assessor without telling your road captain or calling a church." Rhett's voice was level. He was not shouting. He never shouted. Shouting was for people who needed the volume to carry the weight that the words themselves weren't strong enough to hold, and what he was saying had more than enough weight. 11 months, Silas? You told me this morning not to handle things quietly." "I know what I told you." "Then you understand what I'm looking at right now." Silas set the letter back on the workbench. He turned toward Rhett, finally, and his face had that quality that Rhett had seen perhaps 3 times in 12 years. Not the calculating front, not the controlled president face, but the one underneath it, the one that existed in the space between what Silas Crow had decided to be and what he actually was. The one that showed the cost of deciding, every day for 30 years, to be the heaviest thing in every room. "I didn't want to call a church," Silas said, "until I knew whether there was something worth calling one about. And now there is." "Now there is," Silas agreed, quietly. The admission sitting in the rain-cold air between them like something solid. Rhett looked at him. "Is there anything else?" Silas was quiet. "Silas." Rhett's voice had lost the edge of confrontation and arrived somewhere that was either more serious or less bearable, depending on how you were standing. "Is there anything else I don't know?" The side yard held its quiet. The last of the rain tapped on the lean-to roof in diminishing intervals, thinking about stopping. One of the motorcycles in the road dripped water from a handlebar. Silas reached into the inside pocket of his vest, removed an envelope. It was not folded, not crumpled. It had been carried for a while, but with care, the envelope of someone who has been keeping a thing present without quite deciding what to do with it. He handed it to Rhett. Rhett opened it. It was a single page. County letterhead again, but not the assessor's office this time. This was the County Board of Supervisors. The date was 6 weeks ago. The language was not carefully neutral. It was a notice of intent to reclassify the Iron Lantern auto property as non-conforming, initiating a process that would, pending the board's formal review in 3 weeks, result in the revocation of the operating permits issued in 1994 and the subsequent cessation of business operations at the current address. Rhett read it twice. The second time he was looking for language he might have missed on the first pass. Some qualifier, some conditional, some procedural hedge that would reduce the weight of what he was reading. He did not find one. He looked up. "This is a shutdown notice." "It's a notice of intent," Silas said. 3 weeks before the board meeting. Silas, this is a shutdown notice. The rain stopped. Completely, suddenly, the way rain in Kentucky sometimes does, as if a decision has been made. The side yard went abruptly quiet, and in that quiet the letter felt heavier in Rhett's hands than a single page of paper should feel. "How long have you had this?" Rhett said. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Rhett looked at the motorcycles, at the garage, at the building that had been the center of this club's legitimate existence since before he'd earned his patch, since before he'd come back from the second tour with a scar on his jaw and nowhere obvious to be. He thought about 22 years of operating permits and customer invoices, and a whiteboard with tire inventory numbers that nobody had erased. He thought about the shovelhead engine in the service bay and the two prospects cleaning their hands at the sink and the long wooden tables salvaged from a church auction in 2003. He thought about Silas carrying this for 6 weeks. "Why?" he said. The single word was not accusation. It was something worse. It was the sound of a man who needs to understand something and is not sure he wants to. Silas looked at the motorcycles for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, stripped of its usual architecture of control, arriving at something closer to the actual register of whatever was underneath. "Because if I tell the table," he said, "we have to fight it. And if we fight it, it becomes a war. And if it becomes a war," he stopped, started again. "I've been running this club for 23 years, Rhett. I have watched every man who went to war over a piece of ground end up losing something more important than the ground." Rhett stared at him. "So you were going to what? Let it happen? Let them take the property?" "I was looking for another way." "For 6 weeks?" "Yes. While Danny Holt was running Grant Hollis at your road captain's motorcycle." The words landed. Silas's jaw tightened. "I didn't know about Grant." "You knew about Danny." "Not that he'd go this far." "Silas?" Rhett's voice was very quiet now, very still, the kind of stillness that comes from being on the other side of something you cannot unmake. "You knew about Danny Holt for 6 weeks, and you didn't tell me. And this morning, while we were standing in that lot, you let me think this was about Grant's grievance. You let me think it was finished." Silas said nothing. "A little girl walked across that lot," Rhett said. "A 7-year-old child who is not connected to any of this walked across a parking lot and told us about a man touching a gas tank, and we called it handled. And the whole time you were standing there knowing that the man who sent Grant doesn't need the bike to work, he just needs an incident. He just needs something he can point at in 3 weeks when he walks into that board meeting and says these men are a danger to this community." He held up the letter, and now he has one. Silas looked at the letter, then at Rhett. Something in his face had arrived at a place that was past calculation, past the controlled front, not broken. Nothing about Silas Crow was going to break in a side yard in the rain, but altered. The specific alteration of a man who has been trying to protect something alone for long enough that the protecting itself has become the damage. "I know," Silas said. "That's not enough," Rhett said. "Not right now." He put the letter in his pocket. He stood in the wet gravel of the side yard, and he looked at the man who had been his president for 12 years, who had been the specific gravity at the center of the only place Rhett had found after coming home that felt like it could hold the weight of what he'd brought back with him. And he felt the complicated coexistence of anger and loyalty, and the specific grief of discovering that the person you trusted to be carrying the thing straight had been carrying it crooked out of love. "Call the table," Rhett said. "Tonight, all of them." Silas didn't move. "Silas?" Rhett's voice was the flattest it had been. "Call the table, or I will." Silas looked at him for a long moment in the quiet after the rain. Then he reached into his pocket, took out his phone. But before he could dial, Rhett's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. The number was one he didn't recognize. Local area code, a cell number, not in his contacts. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something stopped him. He answered. "Yeah." A voice on the other end, female, adult, controlled in the specific way of someone who is controlling it deliberately. "This is Elena Rowan. Silas Crow gave me this number." A pause. "I think someone's been watching my house." The side yard went very still around Rhett. "How long?" he said. Since we got home this afternoon. A car I don't recognize has been parked across the street, different position twice in 3 hours. Another pause, shorter. Maisie noticed it first. Rhett looked at Silas. Silas was watching him, reading the conversation from the one side of it he could hear, and his expression had arrived at something Rhett had not seen on it in a very long time. Not calculation, not control. Something that looked for just a moment like fear. "Don't turn on any additional lights," Rhett said into the phone. "Don't go near the front windows, and don't open the door for anyone until you hear from us." He was already moving toward his motorcycle. "We're coming." He hung up, looked at Silas. "He moved faster than we thought," Silas said. "Yeah," Rhett said. "He did." The garage door was still open. The shovelhead engine sat cooling in the service bay, its job unfinished, the work of the day suspended mid-sentence. The rain was gone and the air had the cold clarity that follows it, every surface sharp and wet and bright under the late afternoon light. Rhett pulled his vest straight. Silas was already moving toward the bikes, and around the side yard, the clubhouse door was opening. Men coming out without being called, reading the movement the way they always did, the way they had been reading each other's bodies across parking lots and highways and situations that required no announcement for 12 years. They could feel it. Something had changed. Something that had started as a parking lot incident and a loosened fuel fitting had grown, in the course of a single day, into something that now sat in front of them large and certain and pointed directly at a woman and a child who had done nothing except refuse to look away. Rhett started his motorcycle. The engine came to life with a sound like a fist hitting a table, decisive, immediate, the specific declaration of a machine that has been built for movement and has been asked to be still long enough. 20 engines followed. The sound filled the side yard and rolled out into the damp evening air above Clarkson, Kentucky, above Route 9, and the diner and the gravel lot where the morning had begun, above the building on Main Street where a man with careful clothes was sitting at a desk with a prepaid phone in his drawer and a board meeting in 3 weeks and a plan that had already, without his knowing it, crossed a line it was not going to be allowed to. 20 motorcycles hit Route 9 like a controlled detonation. Not fast. That was the thing that would have surprised anyone watching from the road. Not the reckless surge of men running hot on anger and adrenaline. They moved at exactly the speed limit, in a formation so precise it looked rehearsed, 2 columns of 10 with Rhett at the point and Silas riding second behind him, the way they always positioned when the situation called for visibility over stealth. The engines were loud, but the pace was deliberate, and in the cold air after the rain, every exhaust note was crisp and separate. 20 distinct voices saying the same thing. "We are coming, and we are not hiding it." Rhett had Elena on speaker in his jacket pocket, the phone tucked against his chest, her voice coming through barely audible over the engine. She was doing what he'd told her, away from the front windows, Maisie in the interior hallway, the lights she'd already had on left on so the house looked unchanged from the outside. She was calm in the way people get calm when fear has moved past its first pitch, and settled into something more functional, more animal, the specific steadiness of a person who has identified a threat and is now operating on the frequency of pure management. "Still there?" he said. "Still there," she said. "Same car. It moved once. It's on the other side of the street now, further down, but the sight line to my front door is better from there." "You're sure it's the same car?" "Blue Civic, 8 years old. The left rear quarter panel is dented and there's no front plate." "I don't make mistakes about cars twice, Mr. Maddox." He almost said something about the Mr. Maddox, but didn't. "What's Maisie doing?" A brief pause. "Reading. She says she's not scared." "Is she?" Another pause, shorter. "No, that's actually the problem." Rhett processed this and then stopped processing it because Sycamore Street was 2 blocks ahead, and the car was still there. He could see it now from the corner. Blue Civic, left rear quarter panel, no front plate, exactly where Elena had said, parked just far enough down the street that a casual observer would file it as nothing. Far enough for plausible deniability. Close enough that whoever was in it had a clean view of Elena Rowan's front door. He said into the phone, "We're here. Stay inside." He pulled to the curb. 20 Harleys occupied Sycamore Street with the thoroughness of a sentence that cannot be argued with. The sound of them going quiet was almost as significant as the sound of them arriving. 20 engines cutting off in a staggered sequence, a diminishing thunder that ended in a silence so complete it had physical weight. The blue Civic did not move. Rhett sat on his bike and looked at it for a long moment. Behind him he could feel the formation, men still mounted, visors up, not moving, not speaking, reading the space the way they'd been trained to read it, the way you read streets and vehicles and angles of sight when you've spent time in places where reading those things incorrectly had permanent consequences. 3 of them had done exactly that, in exactly those places. "Plates obscured," said a voice from behind and to his left. Dutch, their youngest full member, who had eyes that worked at distances most people's didn't. "Backplates mud-covered, deliberate." "How many inside?" Silas said. He was dismounting, unhurried, the way he did everything. "1. Driver's seat. Not moving." Rhett swung off his bike. He walked toward the Civic at the same pace he'd walked across the diner parking lot this morning. The pace that covered ground without announcing urgency. The pace of someone who has already decided what they're doing and sees no reason to perform it. He was aware of Silas falling into step beside him and 2 others flanking wide, moving to cover the vehicle's exit angles without instruction, without signal, just the practiced geometry of men who understood their positions in a formation the way a body understands its own limbs. He stopped at the driver's window. The man inside was young. That was the first thing. Younger than Rhett had expected, early 30s maybe, with the lean, angular face of someone who didn't eat enough and the particular complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors. He was wearing a gray hoodie and had his phone face down on the passenger seat and his hands on the steering wheel, and he was looking straight ahead through the windshield at the street ahead of him, as if the 20 motorcycles and the men standing at his window were a weather event he had decided to wait out. Rhett tapped the glass. Once. The man's jaw moved. His hands tightened on the wheel. He turned his head slowly, with the specific reluctance of someone who has been pretending very hard and has just been told the pretending is over. He lowered the window. "I'm not doing anything," he said. His voice was young, too. Slightly too high for the face he was wearing. "This is a public street." Rhett looked at him, at the phone face down on the passenger seat, at the hands on the wheel, white-knuckled, at the eyes, which were moving slightly, not settling on Rhett's face but going to the mirrors, checking the flanking positions, doing arithmetic. "What's your name?" Rhett said. "I don't have to tell you." "I know you don't." Rhett's voice was even, not threatening in any performative sense, just flat, the way a wall is flat. "What's your name?" A pause. Then, too quiet. "Kevin." "Kevin." Rhett let it sit. "Kevin, there's a woman in that house who called me because she's been watching you adjust your parking position twice in 3 hours while she's been home with her 7-year-old daughter." He paused. "What are you doing on this street?" "I told you, public street." "Kevin." The voice now was Silas's, from behind Rhett's left shoulder, and the specific quality of it, lower, older, carrying 30 years of having been the person in the room with the most gravity, made Kevin's hands tighten on the wheel again. "My road captain asked you a question. I'm going to ask you the same question one time, and what you do with that opportunity is going to determine a lot about how this evening goes for you." Kevin looked at the rear-view mirror. His breathing had changed, shallower, faster, the breath of someone calculating options and arriving at the conclusion that the options are limited. His eyes went to his phone on the passenger seat. "Don't," Dutch said from the rear passenger side of the car, close enough to the window that his voice came through clearly. "Don't touch that." Kevin's hand, which had been moving, stopped. The street held its quiet. A porch light came on 3 houses down. A dog somewhere behind them barked twice and then was quiet. The air smelled like wet pavement and the last exhaust of 20 engines. Kevin said finally to the windshield, he said, "Just watch. That's all. Just watch. And send him the timestamps when she came and went." Silas said. Kevin's jaw worked. "I need—" "Kevin." Silas moved to stand beside Rhett, filling the driver's window with 2 men instead of 1, and his voice did not raise, but it dropped into a register that ended the sentence Kevin had been attempting. "You're going to give me a name, and you're going to do it now, because you are sitting on a public street having just admitted to surveilling a private residence, And the only question remaining is whether you do this conversation with us or you do it with a deputy named Aller, who is going to be very interested in your connection to someone who organized this morning's incident." He paused. "The name." Kevin looked at the steering wheel. He looked like what he was, a young man who had taken money for something that had felt manageable in the abstract and was now sitting inside the concrete version of it and finding the dimensions much larger than advertised. "Holt," he said. The word came out small and exhausted. "Danny Holt. He called me yesterday. Said it was property research, watching who came and went from an address. And you didn't ask why. He paid $400 up front." Kevin's voice had taken on the particular quality of shame that sounds like defensiveness because it hasn't figured out yet what else to sound like. "I'm 3 months behind on—" "Stop," Rhett said, not unkindly, just a termination of the explanation. "Get out of the car." Kevin blinked. "What?" "Get out of the car, Kevin. You're going to call Aller, right now, tonight." "I can't," Kevin started, then looked at the 20 men behind the 2 at his window. "Okay," he said. "Yeah. Okay. Dot." Oler arrived on Sycamore Street 20 minutes later with the expression of a man who had been on his way home for the first time all day and had received a phone call that redirected him before he'd made it 3 blocks. He parked, got out, looked at the cluster of motorcycles and the young man sitting on the curb with his hands on his knees and Rhett standing behind him with his arms crossed. Then he looked at Silas. "You want to tell me," Oler said, "why I'm here?" "Kevin here has something to tell you," Silas said. "He was hired this afternoon to surveil the residence of Elena Rowan, the woman whose daughter was involved in this morning's incident." Oler looked at Kevin. "You got ID?" Kevin produced his wallet. Oler looked at it. "Kevin Marsh," and he handed it back. "Mr. Marsh, are you willing to make a statement?" "He's willing," Rhett said. "Mr. Marsh has to be the one to tell me that." Kevin looked up from the curb. He had the hollowed-out look of someone for whom this evening had removed several layers of whatever protective coating he'd been operating behind. "Yeah," he said. "I'll tell you." Oler looked at Silas. The look that passed between them was not warm and was not hostile, and contained, somewhere in the middle of it, the specific acknowledgement of 2 men who have been on different sides of things long enough to have developed a working fluency in each other's languages. "Second time today," Oler said. "Yeah," Silas said. Holt, Silas confirmed. Oler looked at the street, at the house, at the window where, if you looked carefully, you could see the slight movement of a curtain where someone had checked and then stepped back. "She all right?" "She's fine. Child's fine." Oler nodded slowly. He took out his notepad and looked at Kevin Marsh on the curb and began the procedural machinery of a statement with the flat, efficient energy of someone who has done it many times today and is running on the last quarter tank of their patience, but will complete the task correctly regardless. "All right, Mr. Marsh. Start from the beginning." Rhett walked away from the curb. He walked to Elena's front door and knocked twice, then once. No pattern he'd announced to her, just the specific rhythm that felt like it's me and not whatever you were worried about. The door opened almost immediately. Elena was standing in the doorway with one hand on the frame and the expression of someone who had spent the last 20 minutes in the interior hallway of her own house breathing carefully and was now arriving at the other side of it. She was still in her morning clothes, the jeans and the canvas jacket she'd been wearing when she walked to the diner, which felt like several days ago rather than this morning. Behind her, at the end of the hallway, Maisie sat on the floor with a book open across her knees and looked at Rhett with the uncomplicated recognition of someone encountering a known quantity. "Hi," Maisie said. "Hi," he said. "I wasn't scared," she said. "I know," he said. Elena said, "Was it?" "Hired surveillance. Young guy, 3 months behind on rent, answered the wrong phone call." Rhett paused. "Holt?" Elena absorbed this. Her jaw tightened. "He moved fast. He didn't have a lot of time." Rhett looked past her down the hallway, not intrusively, just taking in the dimensions of the space, the layout, the doors, the sight lines from the front windows, the particular way a person looks at a place when they're thinking about it as something that needs to be secured. Do you have somewhere else you can stay tonight? Family, a friend? My sister's in Louisville. That would work. That's 3 hours. I know. He looked at her directly. I think it would be better if you weren't here tonight. Elena held his gaze for a moment. She was doing the calculation he could see her doing, weighing the seriousness of his expression against her own read of the situation, measuring the ask against what she knew and didn't know about what was actually at stake. She was not the kind of woman who deferred. He could tell that about her from the way she'd stepped between him and Maisie in the lot this morning. Tell me what you actually know, she said. Not what you think I can handle. What you actually know. Rhett looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Danny Holt has a board meeting in 3 weeks that could end our club's operating status in this county. He organized this morning's incident to create a record of violence associated with this club before that meeting. The incident failed. He moved to surveillance within 6 hours, which means he's already planning the next one. He paused. And the fact that you and Maisie are visible, connected to this morning, that makes you a resource he might decide to use. Elena's hand tightened on the door frame. Use how? Testimony, pressure, a narrative about the club that plays well to a county board. He looked at her steadily, or something less official. The hallway behind Elena was quiet. Maisie had looked up from her book and was watching them with the focused attention she brought to conversations that adults were having as if she weren't there, which was the kind of attention that tended to catch everything those adults were trying to obscure. Okay, Elena said, after a moment. Louisville. Tonight, Rhett said. Tonight, she said. Not happy about it, clear about it. Met. She was packed in 40 minutes. Maisie helped with the focused efficiency of a child who has been told there is a reason and has decided to trust the reason without requiring all the details, which was, Rhett thought, watching her move through the house with her small backpack and her Velcro sneakers and the napkin drawing of his motorcycle tucked carefully into the front pocket of the bag, maybe the healthiest relationship with uncertainty he had ever observed in anyone of any age. They walked out to the car. Elena's sedan, a 10-year-old Accord with a cracked side mirror and a Louisville Cardinals sticker on the bumper that had faded to almost nothing. She put the bags in the trunk with the efficient movements of someone who has been doing things for themselves for long enough that they have gotten very good at it. Silas was standing at the curb, Aller having left 20 minutes ago with Kevin Marsh in the back seat and a new page of notes on his pad. He looked at Elena. She looked at him. The look between them was not warm and was not hostile and contained something in the middle that was closer to mutual assessment, two people recalibrating their read of each other in real time. The statement I gave Aller this morning, Elena said, about what I saw in the lot, is that going to be something Holt can use? He can try, Silas said. What you saw exonerates us. I know that. I'm asking if he'll try anyway. He'll try anyway, Silas said. He'll try to frame it as your statement being coerced, your presence in the lot as something we arranged. A pause. It won't hold, but he'll try. Elena nodded slowly. So my daughter and I are characters in his story now. You were always going to be characters in his story, Silas said. Maisie made you relevant to ours first. Something moved across Elena's face at that. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated. The expression of a person arriving at an understanding of something they hadn't had the full shape of before. She looked at Maisie, who was standing beside the car examining the chrome road pin from her shorts pocket, turning it in the porch light. Mr. Chrome, Elena said. Silas, he said. She looked at him. Silas, what happens if you lose the board meeting? He was quiet for a moment. In the street behind them, the last few bikes were pulling away, men dispersing back to the clubhouse or to whatever the evening held for them. The formation dissolving into individual lives the way formations do when the immediate need has passed. The street was settling back into its ordinary quiet. We lose the garage, he said. Legally, the club's operating license is tied to the business. No business, no license. No license, and everything becomes, he chose the word carefully, complicated. Complicated like you have to move. Complicated, like everything we've built here for 22 years becomes something that can be taken apart one piece at a time. He said it without effect, in the tone of someone who has been living with that possibility long enough that they've worn the emotion off the edges of it. The garage isn't just a business. It's the reason we have legal standing to exist in this county. Elena looked at him. He's not just trying to move you. He's trying to erase you. Yeah, Silas said. That's exactly right. The porch light caught the angles of his face, the lines, the gray at his temples, the specific landscape of a man who has been weathered by choices rather than time. Elena looked at him, and then she looked at the clubhouse building across Route 9, its lights on, its parking lot still populated with a few bikes, the neon sign of the diner beyond it casting its thin red light across the wet asphalt. 22 years, in a town that had spent the entire time afraid of them. Drive safe, Silas said. She got in the car. Yeet. The phone call came at 11:47. Rhett was in the back room of the clubhouse with the property documents spread across the long table, his third coffee of the evening gone cold at his elbow. Two other members working through the permit documentation with the focused grimness of men who have been told the fire is structural and are looking for the load-bearing walls. The table had been called at 9, not the full table, just the core members, the ones whose names were on the founding documents and the operating licenses, the ones whose decisions had weight. Silas had told them everything, all of it. The assessor's letter from 11 months ago, the board notice from 6 weeks ago, the full geometry of what Danny Holt was attempting. The room had received it the way rooms receive things that are large and had been withheld, with a silence that was not empty but was instead extremely full, packed with the specific density of things men are not saying, because the things men are not saying would not improve the situation. Nobody had shouted. That was the thing about the men in this room. They had all, in their various ways, done time in places where shouting solved nothing and cost attention you needed elsewhere, and they had imported that lesson into every room they subsequently occupied. But the silence after Silas finished had been the loudest thing Rhett had heard all day. Now it was 11:47, and the phone on the table lit up with a number none of them recognized, and Silas looked at it for a beat, and then answered it on speaker. "Crow," he said. A voice came through the speaker, male, older, carrying the particular quality of vocal authority that comes from spending a long time in rooms where you're the most expensive person present. "Mr. Crow, my name is Thomas Fell. I believe you've been trying to reach me." The room went very still. Silas's eyes moved to Rhett's across the table. Rhett's face did not change. He reached forward and moved the speaker slightly, adjusting the angle, and then he settled back in his chair and became very quiet and very present in the way that men who have learned to listen at gunpoint learn to listen. "Mr. Fell," Silas said, "I wasn't expecting you this evening." "No," Fell said. "I imagine not." A pause. Deliberate. Measured. The pause of someone managing a conversation rather than inhabiting it. "I'm calling because I find myself in a position I don't particularly enjoy, and I've found over 40 years of practice that positions I don't enjoy are best addressed directly." "All right. My client," Fell said, "has engaged in activities today that exceed the scope of the representation I agreed to provide him. I became aware of this approximately 2 hours ago." Another pause. "I want to be precise about what I'm telling you, Mr. Crow, because precision matters here. I am not disclosing privileged communications. I am telling you that there are aspects of today's events that my client did not inform me of, and that I would not have authorized had I known." Silas's jaw was very tight. "What aspects?" "The individual in custody this morning," Fell said. "Grant Hollis. My client's relationship to Mr. Hollis was not one I was aware of. The nature of the arrangement between them—" He stopped, started again, differently. "I've been practicing law in this county for 40 years, Mr. Crow. I know where most of the lines are. My client appears to have crossed several of them today in ways that were not part of what I agreed to help him accomplish." "You agreed to help him with the zoning." "I agreed to represent him in a property dispute." "Yes." Fell's voice was precise and dry in the way of old attorneys stripped of performance. "What happened in your parking lot this morning was not a property dispute." The table was very quiet. The coffee maker on the counter had long since finished its last cycle, and the room smelled like the ghost of burned coffee and old paper and the particular slightly oily scent that accumulates in rooms where men who work with machinery gather. "Mr. Fell," Silas said carefully, "why are you calling me?" A long pause, long enough that the quality of the silence on the line became something active, something considered. "Because tomorrow morning," Fell said, "my client intends to present the County Board of Supervisors with a petition signed by 14 Clarkson business owners requesting an emergency review of your operating permits, citing today's incident as evidence of ongoing public safety concerns associated with your organization." Another pause. "He has those signatures. I've seen the petition. It is—" The precise voice seemed to choose a word with care. "Persuasively constructed." Rhett looked at Silas. 14 signatures. The table shifted almost imperceptibly around them. Men absorbing information, recalculating, the internal machinery of people who operate on strategy rather than reaction doing its work. "Emergency review," Silas said. "The board has the authority, under the county charter, to conduct an emergency review and issue a temporary suspension of business operations pending a full hearing. The full hearing is already scheduled for 3 weeks from now. A temporary suspension would be public," Silas said, "before the hearing." "Yes." "And would become the public record that frames the hearing." "Yes," Fell said. "That is the function it would serve." His voice had the quality of a man stating facts that he finds distasteful but will not hide from. "The petition is being filed tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. You have—" A pause. "You have until 8 a.m. The room held its silence. Outside, somewhere on Route 9, a truck passed, its sound moving through the walls as a low vibration. "Mr. Fell," Silas said. "Why?" "I told you, I find myself in—" "No." Silas's voice had dropped into a register that was very quiet and very direct. "Not why are you calling, why the rest of it? You've known Danny Holt for how long? You've represented him for how long? And you're calling me at midnight to tell me about a petition that your client is filing tomorrow morning." A pause. "Why?" The silence on the line was different this time. Longer. And underneath the length of it was something that Rhett, listening, could identify as the specific quality of a man who is carrying something that has become too heavy to carry the direction he's been carrying it. "My daughter," Fell said, finally, quietly. "Works at a school, on the east side of town." Nobody in the room moved. "She has told me, more than once, that the only people who consistently show up to that school's fundraisers and fix things in the parking lot and jump the teachers' batteries in January are the Iron Lantern Riders. That nobody asked them to, that they just—" He stopped. "She told me that last year a man named Rhett Maddox spent 3 Saturdays repairing the roof of the gymnasium because there was a leak and the school couldn't get it in the budget and nobody came. She told me he brought 3 other men, and they paid for the materials themselves and refused to be recognized for it." The room was completely silent. Fell's voice, when it continued, was flatter than it had been, stripped of its attorney architecture, arriving at something closer to the voice a man uses when he is speaking as himself. "I've represented some bad men in 40 years, Mr. Crow. Men who were bad in ways I could understand because the badness had a shape I recognized. My client is bad in a way I did not recognize until today, and what I did not recognize was how small it was, how—" He seemed to search. "How willing he was to use people. Children. A young man desperate for rent money. A grieving man's bitterness." A pause. "I will not be his attorney after tomorrow, but I can give you tonight." He hung up. The room stayed quiet for a long time after the call ended. The speaker sat in the middle of the table, dark and silent, next to the cold coffee and the property documents and the permit files that Rhett had pulled from 7 boxes. Then a man named Vic, who was the oldest full member at 64 and had been sitting at the far end of the table without speaking for the entire meeting, said, 14 signatures. "Yeah," Silas said, "by 8 a.m. Yeah, it's midnight." "I know what time it is, Vic." Vic was quiet for a moment, then, 14 business owners in this town signed a petition against us." Silas looked at the table. "Yeah. Same town we've been in for 22 years. "Yeah." The quality of that, yeah. The specific flatness of it. The particular way it absorbed and contained what Vic was actually pointing at, which was not a logistical problem, but a wound, was the most honest thing Silas had said all day. It sat in the room and everyone felt it land, and nobody said anything about it directly because there was no way to say it directly that would help. Rhett was looking at his phone, at Elena's contact entry that he'd added this evening. He thought about what she'd said. He's not just trying to move you. He's trying to erase you. He thought about 14 business owners who had spent 22 years accepting the club's presence in this town, accepting the road fundraisers and the winter tire donations and the 3 Saturdays on a school gymnasium roof, and who had signed a petition anyway, not because they believed the club was dangerous, because Danny Holt had asked them to, and Danny Holt owned properties adjacent to theirs and sat on the Chamber of Commerce board and had the particular kind of power that operates through relationship debt rather than force. The specific way the world works sometimes. The specific way it had always worked, for men who wore the wrong kind of jacket and had the wrong kind of name and did all the right things without ever being credited for them. We can counter it, Rhett said. He said it to the table, not to Silas specifically, to all of them. If he's filing at 8, we can be there at 7:30 with our own documentation. 22 years of operating permits, not a single formal complaint, community contributions on record. We pull everything we have. The garage's community contribution record isn't on file with the county board, someone said. Then we file it tonight, Rhett said. Everything. School roof receipts if we have them, donation records, the road safety events, every piece of paper that shows what this club has actually been in this town. The county recorder's office isn't open at midnight, someone else said. The emergency filing window is, Rhett said, for business license disputes. It was part of the charter revision in 2018. Silas got it added. He looked across the table at Silas, who was sitting very still with his hands flat on the table, looking at the permit documents with an expression that was past calculation and had arrived somewhere quieter. Silas looked up. You got the emergency filing window added to the charter because you knew this day was coming, Rhett said. You've known something like this was coming for a long time. That's why you kept every piece of paper. That's why the documentation policy. That's why the statements and the photographs and the signed copies. He paused. Tell me I'm wrong. Silas looked at him. You're not wrong. Then let's use it. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, it still won't be enough. The room shifted. What does that mean? Vic said. Silas pushed back from the table. He stood up. He walked to the window that looked out at the side yard, and in the dark outside it, his reflection came back at him from the old glass. The wavery, distorted version of himself, the one that looked like it was underwater. He stood there for a long moment with his hands in his pockets and his back to the room, and the particular quality of his stillness had changed, had arrived at the edge of something. The emergency filing buys us the hearing, he said. 3 weeks from now. It prevents the temporary suspension, but the hearing itself... He stopped, breathed. We're not going to win the hearing on documentation alone. Then what do we need? Rhett said. Silas turned from the window, and his face, the face that Rhett had spent 12 years learning to read in all its controlled configurations, the face he had seen this morning do something complicated and quiet when a small girl had looked up at it with no fear. His face had arrived somewhere new, somewhere that looked, in the harsh fluorescent light of the back room, like the face of a man who has spent a long time deciding something and has just finished deciding it. We need Fell's testimony, he said, on record, his witness account of what Danny told him about Grant, about the surveillance, about the board strategy. Attorney-client privilege ends when the attorney witnesses evidence of an ongoing crime. He paused. Danny isn't just attempting a zoning coup. He organized an attempted vehicular homicide this morning. That changes the category of what this is. The room absorbed this. Fell said he'd resign the representation, Rhett said carefully. He didn't say he'd testify. No, Silas said. He didn't. You think he will? Silas looked at his hands, at the engine stain at the cuticles that didn't wash out. I think he called at midnight because he already knows he will. I think he needed someone to ask him. Rhett was quiet for a moment, then, and if he won't? Silas picked up his phone from the table. Then we find another way. He looked around the room, at the faces of the men who had built this thing with him over 22 years, who had put their names on the licenses and their hours on the gymnasium roof, and their signatures on the statements, and had never, not once, asked to be recognized for any of it. Start pulling documents. Everything we have. Rhett, call Della at County Records. She'll be awake. She's always awake. And she owes us for the transmission job last winter. I need every public record we have standing in this county by 6 a.m. The table moved. People stood, reached for phones, began the machinery of a night that was going to be very long and very purposeful. Rhett was dialing Della's number when the back door of the clubhouse opened. He turned. One of the prospects, a young man named Cal, who had been stationed at the lot since 10 p.m. to watch the bikes, was standing in the doorway. He was breathing slightly harder than normal, and his face had the specific compressed quality of someone delivering news they haven't had time to process themselves. "What?" Silas said. Cal said, "There's a man outside. Says his name is Thomas Fell. Says he drove here from his house." A pause. "He's got a briefcase." The back room went still. Silas looked at Rhett. Rhett looked at Silas. "Bring him in," Silas said. Cal went. The sound of the back door, the sound of boots on gravel, 2 sets, one heavier and slower than Cal's. The room waited with its permits and its cold coffee and its 22 years of carefully kept paper, and the ceiling light buzzed its thin fluorescent note. And outside on Route 9, the last truck of the evening moved through the dark toward somewhere east. Thomas Fell walked into the back room of the Iron Lantern Riders Clubhouse at 12:23 in the morning, carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who has spent 40 years being the most composed person in any room and has, tonight, decided to try something different. He looked at the table, at the documents, at Silas. "I spent 41 years protecting what my clients told me," he said. His voice was steady, old, carrying something in it that sounded like the weight of those 41 years redistributing itself. "I'm going to spend what's left protecting something that matters more." He set the briefcase on the table. He opened it. Inside, in organized folders, were 41 years of Thomas Fell's most careful record-keeping. And inside one of those folders, inside a clipped set of documents that he removed and laid on the table in front of Silas Crow, was the thing that changed everything. Rhett looked at the documents. He read them. He read them a second time to make sure he was reading what he thought he was reading. His hands went flat on the table, because the documents in front of him were not about the zoning dispute. They were not about the property on Route 9 or the operating permits or the county board meeting. They were financial records, bearing Daniel Holt's name, and the name of one other party, a name that appeared on a county document Rhett had last seen 3 hours ago, when he'd been pulling permits from the 4th box and found an 11-month-old assessor's letter that Silas had been carrying alone. The name on Fell's documents and the name on the assessor's letter were the same. Rhett looked up from the table, looked at Silas. Silas was already looking at the documents, and the expression on his face was the one Rhett had seen perhaps 3 times in 12 years. The one that existed underneath the controlled front, the one that showed the cost of everything. But underneath even that, underneath the layers that Rhett had learned to read over 12 years, was something new, something that looked in the fluorescent light like the specific expression of a man who has been carrying a piece of the truth for a long time and has just been handed the piece he was missing. "The assessor," Rhett said. The word came out quiet, flat. "The deputy assessor who signed the inquiry letter, the one who opened the investigation 11 months ago." He looked at Fell. "He's on Holt's payroll." Fell looked at him steadily. "Has been for 3 years." The room didn't make a sound. Because if the deputy assessor was compromised, the inquiry that opened 11 months ago wasn't procedural. It wasn't triggered by Danny Holt's petition from the outside. It had been manufactured from inside the county government, which meant the board meeting in 3 weeks wasn't a hearing. It was a verdict that had already been written, by men who had been paid to write it, in a process that had been designed from the beginning to look like procedure, while the county recorder's emergency line rang 4 times before anyone picked up. Silas was already on his feet, the financial records spread across the table. Fell standing at the edge of the light with his briefcase open and his 41 years sitting heavy in the room. Rhett had his phone in one hand and a pen in the other and was writing names, dates, account numbers onto the back of a permit document with the compressed urgency of a man who understands that information without documentation is just noise. "Emergency filing," Silas said into his phone, the moment the line connected. "Iron Lantern Auto, operating license number KY9847C. I'm invoking the charter provision for contested business license review. I need a filing window open in the next 30 minutes. A pause. "I don't care what time it is. Read the provision." Rhett looked at Fell. "The account transfers, how recent?" "Most recent is 11 days ago," Fell said. He had the steady voice of a man who has made his decision and has moved past the point of second-guessing it into the cleaner air of pure action. Deputy Assessor Crane received 4 payments over 18 months. The final one was, he pointed to the document, 11 days before he signed the board's notice of intent. "That's not circumstantial," Rhett said. "No," Fell said. "It's not." Silas said into the phone, sharp and final. "Then wake someone who can." He lowered the phone, looked at the room. "Vic, take Fell's financial documents, photograph every page, email copies to my personal account and to the garage account, right now, before anything else." He looked at 2 other men. "Pull every community contribution record we have with dates, amounts, signatures. The school roof, the road fundraisers, the toy drives, the battery jumps, all of it. If we have a receipt, I want it on that table." He looked at Rhett. "Call Aller." "It's 12:30. Call him." Rhett called him. Aller answered on the second ring, which told Rhett that Aller had not been sleeping, which told Rhett something about the kind of day Aller had also been having. Rhett gave him the short version: Fell, the documents, Crane, the 18 months of payments, and the silence on the other end had the quality of a man sitting up straight in whatever chair he was in and becoming very awake very quickly. "You have documentary evidence," Aller said. "We have 41 years of Thomas Fell's record-keeping sitting on our table." Another silence. "Fell is there?" "At the clubhouse." "Yeah." "At 12:30 in the morning." "Marcus," Rhett said, and the use of the first name was deliberate. The specific register of one person speaking plainly to another rather than across the space of their respective positions. "Danny Holt is filing a petition at 8 a.m. that has been built on a corrupted assessment process. A county employee took money to manufacture the legal architecture for what happened today. For what almost happened to my bike. For the surveillance on Elena Rowan's house." His voice was flat and even and did not waver. "I need you to decide what side of this morning you want to be on when it's over." The line was quiet long enough that Rhett counted his own heartbeats. 4 of them. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Aller said. He was there in 14. He came through the back door in civilian clothes, jeans, a county jacket, no uniform. And he looked at the table, and at Fell and at the documents, and he did the same thing Rhett had done. Read them once, and then read them again to make sure. Then he looked at Fell. "You're prepared to provide sworn testimony on the origin and contents of these records," Aller said. "I am," Fell said. "You understand that depending on what the DA decides about attorney-client privilege?" "I understand the legal exposure," Fell said. "I've understood it since I got in the car." Aller looked at Silas. Something passed between them that was faster and more direct than anything their previous interactions had contained. The compressed communication of 2 men who have spent years navigating around each other and are now for the first time navigating toward the same point. "I can get a warrant for Crane's financial records by 6 a.m., Aller said. "If Fell's documents corroborate what's in the county accounts, that's enough for the DA to move before the petition filing." "Holt needs to know the petition is dead before he walks into that building," Silas said. "If he files it, even if it gets pulled afterward, it becomes public record. That's what he needs." Aller looked at him. "I know how it works, Silas." "Then you know we have until 7:59. "Yeah." Aller picked up his phone. "I know." He made 3 calls in the next 8 minutes, standing in the corner of the back room with his back to the table, his voice low and precise, and stripped of everything except the procedural content it needed to carry. The room worked around him. Documents photographed, records compiled. Fell's testimony transcribed by a member named Santos, who had 2 years of paralegal training and hands that moved across a keyboard with the specific speed of someone used to keeping up with what the room produced. At 1:47 in the morning, Silas's phone rang. He looked at the screen. He answered it and put it on speaker and set it on the table, and the room went quiet around it. "Mr. Crow?" The voice was female, middle-aged, carrying the no-nonsense flatness of someone who has been woken up and has processed their irritation and moved past it into competence. "This is Assistant DA Patricia Wohl. I've been briefed on what you have. I need 10 minutes of your time and Thomas Fell's." "You have it," Silas said. She took 9. At the end of those 9 minutes, she said, "I'm issuing a hold on the county board filing window pending fraud investigation. No petitions related to Iron Lantern Auto will be accepted for the next 72 hours. I'm also issuing a notification to Deputy Assessor Crane that he is the subject of a formal inquiry." A pause. "Mr. Crow, I want to be direct with you. This hold buys you time. The underlying hearing is still scheduled. The board still has authority to conduct it. What you do in the next 3 weeks with your documentation is going to determine the hearing's outcome." "Understood," Silas said. "And Mr. Fell." Her voice changed register slightly. "I'll be in contact with you directly. I'd recommend you secure independent counsel before our next conversation." "Already planned," Fell said. She ended the call. The room held its silence for 3 full seconds. Then Vic said, from the far end of the table, in the flat, understated tone of a man who has been in enough situations to know that the moment after a crisis breaks is not the moment to perform relief, "Holt doesn't know yet." "No," Silas said. "He's going to find out when he walks into that building at 8 a.m., and they won't take his filing." "Yeah." "What does he do then?" The room looked at Silas. Silas looked at his hands on the table, the engine stain, the old calluses. Outside, Route 9 was completely silent. The diner across the street was dark. The gravel lot was empty and wet, and the chrome of the motorcycles in the side yard caught the thin light from the clubhouse windows and gave it back in fragments. "He panics," Silas said, "and panicked men make mistakes." He lifted his eyes from his hands, "which is why we need to be very, very careful about the next 4 hours." He looked at Rhett. Rhett was already standing. He hadn't sat down since Aller arrived. He had been moving through the room in the contained way he moved when something was not finished, checking the document stacks, the phone, the door, the window. The specific restlessness of a man whose training had taught him that the moment after the immediate threat is addressed is exactly the moment the secondary threat arrives. "He has other instruments," Rhett said. "He's used Grant. He's used Kevin Marsh. He's used Crane inside the county office. He's been building this for months. Those don't all disappear because the filing is blocked." "No," Silas said. "Elena's in Louisville. That's good." Rhett's voice was working through it out loud, the way he processed best. Linear, spoken, each piece arriving in sequence. "But the hearing is still 3 weeks. If Holt knows the financial records are in Aller's hands by morning, he knows Fell talked. He knows his legal architecture is compromised. He has 3 weeks to build something new." "Or to remove the evidence," Fell said quietly. The room went still. Fell was looking at his briefcase, at the documents on the table. "I have copies," he said, "but the originals are in my office, in a safe." He paused. "A safe that Daniel Holt knows the location of, because I showed it to him 3 years ago when he signed his first representation agreement." Silas looked at Fell. "Where's your office?" "Main Street, the old bank building." Fell's voice was steady, but his hands, Rhett noticed, had found each other on the table. Not clasped, just present, the way hands go when a person's body is doing something the person isn't quite acknowledging yet. "Second floor." "The building Danny Holt owns," Rhett said. Fell looked at him. "Yes." The word landed in the room with the specific weight of a thing that should have been said earlier and wasn't, and now sits differently because of the waiting. Silas was on his feet before anyone else. He looked at Rhett. The look between them was the compressed version of everything. 12 years, the table, the permits, the gymnasium roof, the morning in the lot, the little girl with the Velcro sneakers, and the compass rose, all of it present in the single economy of two men who know each other well enough to communicate in the space between words. "How fast can you get there?" Silas said. Rhett was already moving toward the door. Behind him, the room erupted into its own motion, boots on concrete, chairs scraping, phones lighting up. He heard Silas's voice behind him, low and rapid, and Aller's response, and the sound of Fell saying something about the safe combination that Santos was writing down. He heard the side door open, and the cold night air hit him, and then he was in the yard, his hand on his bike, the engine turning over with that sound like a fist hitting a table, decisive and final. 3 more engines followed, then 3 more. They came out of the side yard and onto Route 9, and the sound of them in the 3 a.m. silence of Clarkson, Kentucky, was like something breaking open. Not violent, but irrevocable. The sound of a night that had been moving towards something finally arriving at it. 2 blocks from Main Street, Rhett's headlight caught the windows of the old bank building and what was lit behind them on the second floor, burning in a building that should have been dark at 3 in the morning. And his stomach, the light in Fell's second-floor window was a lamp left on by a cleaning crew. Rhett understood this the moment he got to the door and found it locked and undisturbed. The alarm panel inside the lobby glass showing green, no forced entry, nothing moved. He stood on the sidewalk with his hand on the door handle and his heart doing things that took a moment to slow, and behind him 4 motorcycles idled at the curb in the 3 a.m. silence of Main Street, their exhaust rising in thin columns into the cold air above Clarkson. He exhaled, long and slow, the kind of exhale that carries the whole weight of a night with it. Silas pulled up beside him, cut his engine, sat on the bike for a moment looking at the building and then at Rhett, and the look between them acknowledged everything without naming any of it. The sprint that hadn't needed to happen, the fear that had been real anyway, the fact that a man's body doesn't always wait for confirmation before it decides something is an emergency. "Cleaning crew," Rhett said. "Yeah," Silas said. They sat with that for a moment. The street was empty in both directions. The diner at the far end of the block had its overnight light on, that single low fluorescent above the coffee station that Cora left burning because she said the dark made the place look abandoned, and she'd never once believed in abandoning something that still had use in it. Aller arrived 10 minutes later with a patrol unit. They secured the building properly, confirmed the originals in Fell's safe were untouched, and by 4:15 in the morning, the documents were in an evidence bag in the trunk of Aller's cruiser, and Thomas Fell was in the passenger seat of his own car outside the county administrative building, waiting for the DA's office to formally process the corruption inquiry against Deputy Assessor Crane. At 5:40 a.m., Crane's county credentials were suspended. At 7:12, Danny Holt arrived at the county administrative building with his petition in a manila folder and found Patricia Wohl waiting for him in the lobby with 2 deputies and a set of documents that described, in the precise language of a 41-year career, the financial relationship between himself and a county official whose job had been to assess properties without fear or favor. Rhett heard about it from Aller at 8:30, by phone, standing in the garage's service bay with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he listened. He didn't say much. He said yeah twice and thank you once, and then he stood in the bay for a while after the call ended, looking at the shovelhead engine that the prospects had left half-finished the previous afternoon, its pieces laid out on the workbench with the careful organization of interrupted work, everything present and waiting to be completed. He picked up a wrench, and he finished it. Well, Elena came back from Louisville on a Tuesday, 3 days after the morning at the diner. She came back because Maisie asked to, and because Maisie's reason was that she had left her library book on the hallway floor when they'd packed in a hurry, and it was due back Thursday, and she had not finished it, and she did not believe in returning books unfinished. Elena drove back into Clarkson on Route 9 in the early afternoon with Maisie in the back seat reading the recovered book, and the October light coming through the windshield flat and gold, the kind of light that makes things look like they've always been the way they are, and always will be, which is a lie that light tells very convincingly in Kentucky in the fall. She slowed when she passed the diner. The gravel lot was quiet, 2 bikes parked, the diner sign dark in daylight. The ordinary Tuesday afternoon stillness of a parking lot that held no evidence of what had happened in it 5 days ago. She almost kept driving. She pulled in instead. Cora was behind the counter, as she always was, as she apparently always would be, filling salt shakers with the focused economy of someone who has performed this task so many times it has become a form of meditation. She looked up when Elena and Maisie came through the door. "Heard you went to Louisville," Cora said. "For a few days," Elena said. "Heard the rest of it too." Cora set down the salt. "You want coffee?" "Please." They sat at the window booth. Maisie had her book. Elena had her coffee. The afternoon came through the glass at that low October angle and made the table look warm, made the whole room look like somewhere that had always been safe, which was not something Elena had ever thought about this particular room before 5 days ago. She was still sitting there 20 minutes later when the garage door across the lot opened and Rhett came out. He was in his work clothes, canvas jacket, boots, the leather vest over everything, and he was carrying something in one hand, a small paper bag, the kind from the hardware store 2 blocks down. He crossed the lot without looking up, and then he looked up, and he saw Elena's car, and he stopped. He changed direction. He came through the diner door, and Maisie saw him first and said, "Hi." And he said, "Hi." And this had already become a greeting that needed no architecture around it, just the two of them acknowledging each other across whatever space existed between them with the simplicity of people who have already been through something together and are on the other side of it. He sat across from Elena. Cora brought him coffee without being asked. "How's Louisville?" he said. "Quiet," she said. "My sister has a baby. Nothing is quiet." He almost smiled. It happened quickly, barely there, but Elena caught it. The specific quality of Rhett Maddox almost smiling, which involved one corner of his mouth and a slight change around the scar, and was, she found, more expressive than most people's full smiles. "Grant Hollis," she said. "What happens to him?" Rhett wrapped his hands around the mug. "He's cooperating. Full statement on Holt's involvement. The DA is treating it as organized conspiracy to commit vehicular manslaughter." A pause. "He's going to do time, but less than Danny." "Is that fair?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. "No," he said, "but it's what happened." She nodded, looked at her coffee. "And the board hearing?" 3 weeks, he said. "We'll be there. With everything." A beat. Fell is testifying. Crane took a plea this morning. The signatures on the petition are being withdrawn by 12 of the 14 business owners. Turns out most of them signed because Holt told them it was a routine community safety review and didn't mention the rest of it. A pause. 2 of them actually called Silas to apologize. Elena looked at him. Did he accept it? Rhett looked out the window at the garage, at the lot, at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon surface of a place that 5 days ago had been the site of something that had changed the shape of things. He told them he appreciated the call, he said, which for Silas is basically a standing ovation. She almost laughed. It surprised her the way genuine things sometimes do. Maisie looked up from her book. She looked at Rhett for a moment with those brown eyes that didn't miss much. "Is Silas okay?" she asked. Rhett looked at her. "Why?" He seemed like he was carrying something heavy. The table was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck moved through on Route 9. The October light shifted half a degree. "Yeah," Rhett said. "He was." He paused. "He put some of it down." Maisie appeared to find this sufficient. She went back to her book. Elena watched Rhett's hands on the coffee mug. The engine stain. The old knuckles. The particular way a man holds something warm when he has spent a lot of time in the cold. She thought about what Cora had told her, about 15 years of documentation policies and a club that had learned to protect itself through evidence because it had spent too long being defined by other people's stories. She thought about the gymnasium roof and the 3 Saturdays and the battery jumps in January. She thought about what it costs to keep doing the right thing when the right thing doesn't protect you. "Thank you," she said. She said it quietly, directly, in the tone of someone who has thought about what they are thanking someone for and means the specific thing and not the general version of it. Rhett looked at her. He didn't deflect it or minimize it or do any of the things that people who are uncomfortable receiving gratitude tend to do. He held it for a moment and then he nodded once, and that was enough. He finished his coffee. He stood. He picked up his paper bag from the hardware store. At the door he stopped, looked back at Maisie. "Your compass," he said. She looked up. Her hand went to her pocket, where the road pin had been living since the morning in the lot. She found it, held it up. "Still have it," she said. "Good," he said. "You know what road captains do." She thought about it. "Know the way." "Know the way," he said, "and don't turn back when the road gets hard." He went out. The door closed behind him. Through the window, Elena watched him cross the lot back to the garage, the paper bag in one hand, the afternoon light on his jacket. The garage door opened and he went inside and it closed, and the lot was quiet and ordinary and entirely itself. Maisie put the compass rose back in her pocket. She turned a page. Elena picked up her coffee. The diner was warm. The coffee was hot. Through the window, the light lay gold across the gravel lot, and the idle Harleys and the building with its 22 years of permits, and its long wooden table, and its whiteboard with tire inventory numbers that nobody had erased. And Clarkson, Kentucky, held its Tuesday afternoon breath and was, for a moment, simply a place where things had happened and people remained, and the remaining was its own kind of answer to everything that had tried to end them. Somewhere in the back of Iron Lantern Auto, a shovelhead engine turned over for the first time in 2 days, caught and held, steady and low and certain, the sound of something rebuilt carrying its own weight down the long American road ahead.